What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we have people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted and needed, what might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. Not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely... You can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. And we're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. The second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal, where the goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing, because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep. Right? That's content and asleep. Now, that's a form of contentment. But it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up. Your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs a question, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? Sometimes in my clinical practice, I would have clients who hated their job. They're laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And maybe that was partly because they'd turned themselves into slaves. But it didn't matter. They were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And they needed to make a move, laterally or up. They needed to make a move. And they were often afraid to. And they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They were afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable. And we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it. You don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation, but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older. You're 10 years more bitter. You're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like, think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. Like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. You know, one person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. You know, that's rule 3. Do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing. Let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, about who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted, if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient. And that's a great gradient emotionally because, as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation. Psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. And cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning. And it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal. Well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It's just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. The hero has to be a monster. But a controlled monster. Batman is like that, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. One question is, you're kind of implicitly moral insofar as you're socialized. But that's sort of procedural. It's just built into you. This is different. This is also becoming conscious of it.
and expanding out your personality into dimensions that it wouldn't normally occupy. So this happens to people all the time. So, for example, lots of my clients, my clinical clients, are too agreeable. And they're generally women, because women are more agreeable than men, but not always, because I've had agreeable men as clients as well. And what happens is they're resentful and they don't know how to stand up for themselves, and it's because they're very compassionate by nature. And so if you're entering into a negotiation with them, they'll let you win. Well, that's not so good, because you need to win too. Especially if you're in an organization of adults where there's a struggle, right? When you have kids, you can let them win, especially infants. You have to let them win, and that's partly why compassion is so necessary. But as a basis for negotiation between adults, it's like, sorry, it's insufficient. You have to be a bit of a monster so that you can say no. And so a lot of what you do in psychotherapy is treat people's anxiety and depression. That's a huge chunk of it. Help them straighten out the way they think. That's a huge chunk of it. But another chunk of it is, well, let's toughen you up. Let's put you in a position where you can bargain. Let's teach you how to assert yourself and stand up for yourself. And that's assertiveness training. And it's a huge chunk of psychotherapy. And you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. You can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, and so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and it's not good. Then you get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It isn't so straightforward to determine what our place is in the world. And the thing that really got me with regards to that wasn't the good that we could do, but the harm that we can do. Because you can debate about the good we can do, but you cannot debate about the harm we can do. That's done. We know, if we want to know. And I think my experience was, when I took that seriously, which meant understanding how that was about me, about, there's a city, and the city is full of people who are sinful. What does that mean? Well, to sin is an archery term. It means to miss the mark. So these are people who aren't oriented properly. And so the city is in a chaotic state. And God tells Jonah that he's going to go to that city and tell them just exactly what's up with them. And Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. And why? Well, that doesn't require much explanation. It's like, how popular are you going to be if you go to a city full of chaotic people and tell them why they're stupid and wrong? Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care if God's telling me to do it. So his conscience is telling him to do it, or his destiny is telling him to do it, or his orientation with higher morality is telling him to do it. You can read it any way you want. And so he thinks, no, I'm hopping on this boat and I'm getting as far away from that city as I possibly can. And so he does that, and then the storm comes up because God thinks, no, you're not getting away. If I told you to do something, you're not getting away from it. A storm comes up. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's easy. Betray your destiny and see how long it takes you to be drowning in a storm. It'll happen immediately, and of course it will, because what's calling you to be your best is exactly the thing that's pushing you forward to manifest yourself most fully in the world. It's what you need. You run away from that, the boat's going to start to rock very, very quickly. Well, you all know that. You know that perfectly well. It's hell, all you have to do is not study for an exam that you know that's coming up to see everything the storm waters start to rise and everything start to rock. It's pretty bloody obvious. So anyways, he's on this boat and there's a storm, and all of the people on the boat who can't quite discriminate chaos from weather because they haven't differentiated the world to that degree think, oh, the boat wouldn't be about to be swamped if some of us hadn't done something stupid and wrong. And there's logic in that. You might think, well, God has nothing personal against you because of the storm, so you're confusing levels of analysis. But you got to give these people some credit. It's like, maybe they did do something stupid. Maybe they didn't caulk the damn boat properly. Maybe the ropes aren't in as good a shape as they might be. Maybe they weren't paying attention to the weather when they went out on the ocean, you know? Or maybe they haven't made peace with their brother, and so their hearts are bent, twisted out of shape, so they don't make particularly good sailors. It's like the idea that you encounter a storm because you're stupid and wrong is a really good idea, even though it's not of infinite applicability. Anyways, they draw lots. It's a primitive thing to do. It's like, well, it's someone's fault. We don't know who. We're going to throw someone overboard, the worst sinner. Obviously, that's what God wants, some kind of sacrifice. So they all draw lots, and someone loses. And then Jonah stands up and says, well, sorry guys, like I know that I've got a problem with God at the moment, so it's probably me. You better throw me over. And they don't really want to, but he finally convinces them. Over he goes. And the storm settles. Well, you know, sometimes if you're in a group of people in an organization, there is someone in the organization whose head isn't screwed on exactly straight. And they know exactly why it is and what they've done wrong and what puts them in that position. And they are poisoning the entire enterprise. And if you throw them overboard, or better, if they agree voluntarily to leave, then the storm will abate and everything will be okay. So anyways, they throw Jonah overboard, and a whale comes up and swallows him and takes him down to the bottom of the ocean. Well, we already know what that means because we watched Pinocchio. It's like when God abandons you because you've abandoned your destiny, and the storms come up, the probability that you're going to be taken down to the depths is extraordinarily high, and that happens in people's lives all the time. Well, so down there, Jonah repents. Well, what do you do when you're in the underworld? Well, you've been there before when things fall apart on you. Your friends have abandoned you. You're not as popular as you could be. You can't stand to look at yourself in the mirror. Into the underworld you go, and you think, geez, I've done a lot of things wrong. You know, maybe I should reconcile myself with the world and I could get out of this. Well, so that's what Jonah does. He thinks, all right, I've got this destiny. I better go do what God says. So the whale spits him out onto the beach, and off he goes to the city to tell them what's wrong. Well, that's what that represents. That's these symbols, you know. It's so cool. This second one, I really like it. It's so interesting because you see Jonah re-emerging from the whale, and he's got a halo around his head. You say, well, what's a halo? Well, have you ever looked at a quarter? Well, think about a quarter. A quarter's the moon. And who's on the quarter? The queen. The queen is surrounded by the halo of the moon. The queen's queen of the night. Gold coin, that's the king's head on the sun. That's the halo. Well, what comes out of the belly of the fish? It's the illuminated human being. It's the spirit of the illuminated human being. Well, that's what that means. Well, what does that mean? Well, what else would come out of chaos? You know, if you fall apart and then you put yourself back together, what is it that comes back out? Well, at least you're in better shape than you were before, you know, and then maybe you do that 20 times in your life or 50 times, and you do it voluntarily. Every time you do it, you're more like the thing with the halo and less like the thing that's, you know, being thrown overboard by your friends. Agreeableness is a very difficult personality dimension to understand, I think, partly because it's difficult to dissociate from neuroticism and as well from extroversion. Because agreeable people like you, and so that kind of sounds like extroversion, and disagreeable people sound like they're hard to get along with, and they sort of are, but people who are high in neuroticism are hard to get along with too, and they tend to be volatile and irritable. And so most of the time, if you're engaged in a contentious issue with someone and emotions flare, it usually has more to do with trait neuroticism than with disagreeableness per se. So what I'm going to do is try to describe to you what the agreeable trait is on both of its dimensions, also to lay out the pros and cons of existence on that normal distribution, trait normal distribution, at more or less every point. Because I think, the way I look at it anyways, is that of all the traits, agreeableness is the one that seems to come with the most marked positive and negative aspects, features, let's say, so we don't confuse it with aspects, the most positive and negative features at each point on the distribution. It's a very complex, seems to be a very, very complex dimension. So I'll read you some of the questions from the Big Five aspect scale, and that'll give you kind of an initial rule of thumb estimate about whether or not you're agreeable or disagreeable. And so here are some of the questions. Imagine that you're answering these for yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first question is, am not interested in other people's problems. So if you are interested in other people's problems, that tilts you towards agreeableness, and I believe that's agreeableness is divided into compassion and politeness, which also sound like very positive things, right? Because everyone wants to be compassionate and everyone wants to be polite, and so you might say, well, is that a virtue? Are those virtues, with the other end being actually negative, to be not compassionate, not polite? It's certainly worded that way, and that's actually a mistake, because we know that these traits are normally distributed, roughly speaking, right? And that means that there has to be positive and negative features at every single position on the distribution. And so to make the presupposition, for example, that being extroverted is being better than being introverted, or that being emotionally stable is necessarily better than being neurotic, is to make a confusion of moral obligation with trait position. You have to assume that there's advantages and disadvantages all the way along, or the distribution wouldn't have set itself up that way, especially because these seem to be biologically instantiated traits. So, anyways, if you're interested in other people's problems, they like to unburden themselves to you, you care about it. That's a mark of compassion. If you're more or less indifferent to other people's stupid problems and you wish they just get on with it, then you're less compassionate, you're harsher and more, well, at the extreme, more callous. Let's see. Respect authority. That's politeness. That's part of agreeableness. Rarely, let's see. Feel others' emotions. Compassion. Inquire about others' well-being. Compassion. Can't be bothered with others' needs. Take advantage of others. That's disagreeable, obviously. Sympathize with others' feelings. Avoid imposing my will on others. Wait for others to lead the way. Okay, I think all of those were associated with trait agreeableness or disagreeableness. So let's think about this for a minute. So I'm going to tell you how I conceptualize agreeableness. The first thing you want to know is that women are more agreeable than men, about half a standard deviation. And that's approximately enough so that if you took a random male and a random female out of the population and you tried to guess who was more agreeable and you guessed the female, you'd be right about 60% of the time. So, but what's interesting about that, and this is something also to keep in mind, is about normal distributions, you know. So imagine you have a normal distribution so that most people are in the middle, and then you have another normal distribution, male and female, and mostly they overlap. But you see out here and out here, they don't overlap at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best, this is, at worst, this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. Okay, now so you kind of understand that. Now the advantage to being agreeable then is that you're good in teams and you're very much likely to give other people credit. The downside of being agreeable is that you're not very good at putting forward your own interests. And so one of the things that predicts salary across time, for example, is agreeableness, and it predicts it negatively. And so it's part of the reason why women get paid less than men. And this is something for the women in the class to really listen to. Because how you get paid across time depends on a very large number of things, right? It depends on your skills and your abilities and your position and your social network and all of that. But the other thing it depends on is whether or not you actually go ask for money, or maybe that you don't even ask. Because actually you don't ask for money. You tell people that you need to be paid more, or something they don't like will happen. And I don't mean as a threat. I mean that you have to be willing, when you're negotiating, to have an alternative. Go talk to your boss, who isn't going to give you money, because everyone wants money, right? It's a competitive game. You're going to have to go there and say, look, here's what I do. Here's why it's useful. Here's why you have to give me more money. And this is my opportunities if you don't. And then you're not taking your boss's money anyways, because it's very frequently the case that he's working for a whopping big company. But he needs an excuse to give you money, because everyone's asking for money all the time. And so you have to put your case forward powerfully and disagreeably. Now, you don't want to do it too disagreeably, because then he's going to think that you're a son of a bitch, and maybe he's not going to give you anything, and maybe you'll get fired for being mouthy and all of that. And that certainly happens to people who are too disagreeable. You got to get the balance right. But it's definitely the case. And the other thing that happens to women that's also worth noting, and this is probably because they're higher in negative emotion, is they tend to underestimate their own utility in business settings, right? Because if you're trying to evaluate what you're like, and you're more tilted towards negative emotion, then the things that you do that are wrong are going to stand out more on the foreground than the things that you do that are right. So if you go into a negotiation and you're uncertain already because you have self-doubts, and then you're agreeable in the negotiation, what's going to happen is that you're not going to win as often. And winning in a business setting or in a career development setting means more opportunity for promotion and more revenue generated. Now, the downside of that, of course, is as you climb the business hierarchy is that you also have to take on more responsibility. And that responsibility is sometimes unpleasant as well, especially to people who are agreeable, because you're not necessarily liked if you're in a position of authority. And agreeable people really like to be liked. It's their primary motivator, because they're concerned about the maintenance, I would say, of intimate, positive relationships. And that also makes them conflict avoidant. The next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, so, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the so the goal, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal. And that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day. You're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss. And both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and it's such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. And I think we did an economic calculation about that a while back, right? Your time's probably worth $50 an hour, something like that. I mean, you're not getting paid that now, but you're young. And so this is investment time. And what you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So let's say it's $50 an hour, which is perfectly reasonable. So if you waste 6 hours a day, and you are, then you're wasting about $2,000 a week, or about $100,000 a year. So go ahead, but that's what it's costing you every hour. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. So let's say it's not $50, it's 30, whatever. Maybe it's 100. It's somewhere in that range. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. And so that seems like a stupid solution. So anyways, as far as I can tell, that's how you can improve your conscientiousness. Outline a goal that you actually would like to hit. And even better, here's something else you can think about when you're negotiating in your life. You could say, if you're kind of pessimistic, you'd say, well, we have to negotiate an agreement. I'd like to walk away not miserable and resentful. Okay, let's call that a baseline. And that's how you're going to negotiate with your wife or your husband. That's a good thing to know. You want to negotiate so that you don't walk away miserable and resentful, because that makes you hostile, and then you'll work to hurt them. And I would say that's unless you want to hurt them, and then of course they'll happily return the favor. If you want to exist in a place where you're basically hitting each other in the head repeatedly for 30 years, you go right ahead. But I wouldn't say that that's a particularly good way of living. So you might say, well, the minimal precondition for a successful negotiation is that you don't walk away resentful and angry. And so that's also how you know when you have something to say to someone. Because the rule has to be, if you're going to walk away resentful and angry, you've got something to say. Doesn't mean you're right, by the way. But it does mean that you have something to say. But it's kind of a low bar, Like if I wanted to live with you for 30 years, maybe we should say, how about we walk away from our mutual negotiations thrilled? Well, why not? You got to aim for something. You could aim for that. You want to negotiate with your boss for a new salary. You might think, okay, I've got this damn job. How much would I have to be paid so I'd be so bloody excited to go to work I could hardly stand it? Well, you could at least know what that number is. And then you could go there and say, well, look, you like to have me around. I've been doing some thinking. I think if you paid me this amount of money, I'd be so thrilled to go to work that you could hardly even keep me away from here. And your boss might think, wow, I'd actually really like to have someone around who'd be so thrilled to work that I can't get rid of them. It's like, I can't give you all of that. I'll give you 75%. Maybe we can renegotiate it in a year. It's like, hey, good deal. Or you can, be some weaselly coward and go in there and snivel about how awful your life is and walk away barely able to tolerate the outcome of the negotiation. It's like, I wouldn't recommend that. And it's funny because I've watched people do this repeatedly in my clinical practice because we plan all the time because the rule is you're going to come and see me. I'm going to try to help you figure out how to have the life that you want to have. And we're going to think about that strategically. So you're making $50,000 a year right now. Maybe you should be making $150,000 in 3 years. And they think, well, that couldn't happen. It's like, not with that attitude. That's the first thing. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. If you don't ask people for the damn money, if you don't look for a better job, but they're going to come along and just shovel a boat full of money at you. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. But why is that impossible? You look at you people in here. It's like, what the hell is wrong with you? Nothing. So you can probably have what you want. If you could figure out what the hell it was, and then, you diligently pursued it. So, and then maybe you wouldn't whine about being alive. That'd be good because people who whine about being alive are dangerous to themselves and other people. So you might think, I can have what I want. Well, but you better well figure out what it is. And you can't just wait for the, have what you want fairy to show up at your doorstep and grant it, because obviously that's not going to happen. So okay, conscientiousness. Well, we talked about how you could improve that. Social networking. That's another big deal. It's one of the advantages that older people have over younger people. And so, for example, now that I'm in my 50s, roughly speaking, I know a bunch of other people who are, relatively well positioned in the dominance hierarchy, and they know all sorts of people. And so when I go to one of them and say, can you do X or do you know X? They say no, but I know someone who can. And that's a huge advantage. So another thing that you want to think about as you move through life, and this is that use your ability to network properly. And that doesn't mean schmooze, and it doesn't mean go out and impress people. That's all just complete bloody rubbish. It means you try to surround yourself with people who are competent in multiple different dimensions, and you maintain your relationships with them. And that's a trading relationship too, right? It involves reciprocity. But it's a huge advantage. A social network is a huge advantage, and that's something extroverted people can be really good at because, they have that sort of social ability. And that goes along with the ability to sell. So another place that you can pick up power, and power for the good, for the right things, is to consciously develop and maintain your social networks. And that also means, well, let's talk about friendships for a minute. Here's how you know if someone's your friend. A, you can tell them bad news. And they'll listen. They won't tell you why, you're stupid and why that bad thing happened to you and how something worse happened to them once and, derail the whole conversation. You can actually tell them bad news and they'll listen. So that's a good thing. And then this is a weirder thing. You can tell them good news and they'll help you celebrate. And that's a really good way of deciding who you should have around you. Because if you have someone around you, something good happens to you and you're kind of afraid to even admit it because, God, something good happened to you. It's like, you let that be known and it'll certainly be taken away. So, you come out and you sort of tell someone half-heartedly that something good happened to you and they give you a whack and then talk about, the great thing that happened to them 3 years ago. Or worse, the great thing that happened to someone that they knew 3 years ago. It's like, go away from that person. They're not helpful to you. And they're not helpful to themselves either. And so you want to surround yourself. You got to think about this. You got to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best part of you. You can hang around with weasels and losers that are trying to pull you down to justify the fact that they're spiraling downhill as well. And the upside of that is you don't have to have any responsibility and you can all whine about how wretched life is, so that's pretty attractive. But I would say it's also a bad medium to long-term plan. And so it's acceptable and desirable to try to surround yourself with people who are facilitating your development. And you might say, well, I've got people around, I know them well, they're not doing that well and they don't fit into that category. It's like, what's your point? What are you going to do with them exactly? If they'll listen and cooperate with you and move towards a better future, great. If they don't pay any attention and they keep doing the same damn things over and over and they're not going anywhere and it's painful, then maybe the proper thing to do is say, you just have your misery. I'll go off and have my life. And maybe you'll wake up at some point in the future and think that's a better way of being. Because just putting up with it is, they call that enabling, right? You put up with that sort of behavior, you're providing tacit consent for it and even tacit approval. It's like, it's a bad idea. You have, I would say, both the right and the responsibility to surround yourself with people who are good for the best part of you. And that's not the same as, I don't have to elaborate on that. You can figure out what that means. Skills, that's another thing you can do if you want to increase your probability of success. Every time you have an opportunity to take an opportunity that would provide you with a new skill, do it, right? Learn to program, learn to write, learn to read new things, learn to public speak, learn how to introduce yourself to people, learn how to social network, learn how to go talk to your boss in a manner, this is the right way to go talk to someone who's supervising you. I see this problem, and here's a solution. And so I'm coming to talk to you about the problem and the solution. It's like that person is going to want to talk to you a lot. It's like because the other people they're talking to are going to come and say, I've got a problem. Can you do something about it? It's like they don't want to do something about it. They already got 50 things to do, So if you're the person who constantly brings forth a problem, even if they're accurate problems, why are they going to want to have you around? You're just another problem. Don't be a problem for the people who want to give you money. That's a good rule of thumb, man. If someone wants to give you money, then help them do that. And if they want to give you status and success, then help them do that, right? And you do that in part by bringing them solutions. And partly you do that by developing your skills. And so if things aren't going very well for you, this is also a good way of evaluating an opportunity. Should you take an opportunity? Well, here's the rule. Take the opportunity if it will teach you something that you can use for other opportunities. Because then even if it fails, which you probably will, it doesn't matter because you've accrued something of value that you can bring forward to the next situation. So, there's this old Jungian idea that I told you about. In the Chartres Cathedral, for example, the cathedral is made in the form of a cross, and the cross signifies the center of the world, and the dome signifies the sky. And so right below the dome at the center of the world, and it's a cross because the cross is the place of suffering. So that's the center of the world, because that's what you are. You're the place of suffering, right? You're the place of conscious suffering. That's the center of the world. And so inscribed on the floor is a maze, and it's a big maze, and it's a mandala, and there's a kind of a flower-shaped resting place right in the center. And what you're doing is walking in the maze, and you walk all 4 quadrants, and you get to the middle, which is where you want to be. You want to be in the middle. Well, how do you get there? You walk everywhere. And what does that mean? It means every bloody time you're offered an opportunity, take it and develop your skills. And that's better than wealth, by the way. In fact, it actually constitutes wealth, because wealth constitutes what you have when someone takes all your money away, right? That's real wealth. And so the way that you build up that sort of wealth is you turn yourself into someone who's competent in multiple directions. And you can be doing that all the time, right? Especially with the kind of technology that you people have access to. I mean, you can learn anything you want whenever you want. So what a good deal that is, man. And so there's easy fruit hanging that you could pick, and I would recommend that you do that. So here's an example. Let's say you're not doing too bad, so maybe you're in the middle of the normal distribution, then you lose your job. Okay, and let's say you're a conscientious person. And we could say, just for the sake of argument, that you lose your job because of mass layoffs in your company. So it has nothing to do with you. It's fundamentally, it's just like luck of the draw, basically. But then what happens to you? Well, if you're conscientious, you're gonna go after yourself pretty hard. So you're gonna, and especially if you're also high in neuroticism, it's gonna depress you to lose your job. And maybe you're in a situation where you just, for one reason or another, you don't have that many other opportunities. Now, maybe you should have looked for them, but maybe you're in a depressed strata of the economy, or you're geographically located somewhere that makes moving difficult, or so on and so forth, So, but you lose your job, and then you start to get depressed because of that. Well, then as you start to get depressed, it decreases the probability that you're going to look for a job, but it also maybe starts to put stress on your family, and it also starts to decrease the probability that you're going to engage in positive social interaction. So now not only are you unemployed and suffering from economic stress, but your marriage is starting to suffer, and you're starting to isolate yourself from your friends. And then, of course, as your marriage suffers and the stress builds up, then that's going to make you more depressed, and that's going to keep you even farther away from your friends, and that's going to decrease the likelihood that you're going to have enough positive emotion and enthusiasm to look for another job. And then, maybe you want to add a bit of a drinking problem to that just for fun, and you can see that you can get a spiral going that's just taking you down, right? And it's all sorts of things, because lots of times people conceptualize, let's say, you're an unemployed guy and you go to counseling and you get a diagnosis of depression. And the thing about a diagnosis of depression, it's sort of like the assumption is there's something gone wrong with your psychological structure. It's like if you're unemployed and you're depressed, it isn't obvious at all that the problem is in your head. You know what I mean? It isn't even obvious that it's a psychological problem. It's just a problem, and problems can take you out. And so if you're unemployed and you're under economic stress, and your marriage is starting to shake, and you're isolating yourself from your friends, and you're less likely to be motivated to go look for a job, you can sort of think about that as a depressive spiral, but you can also think of it as a conspiracy, in some sense, of external forces that are auguring you into the ground. And we don't tend to conceptualize psychological disorders that way, but we should, because lots of times when people are suffering from something that you could describe in psychological terminology, and depression is a very good example of that, it isn't obvious that there's something wrong with them psychologically. Often they just are in trouble. And there isn't a category in psychological diagnosis for client in serious trouble. But my experience has been almost without exception that the people that come to see me because something's gone wrong with their life, not because they have a psychological problem. Now you could say, well, their psychological inadequacies, such as they might be, are interfering with their ability to recover, or maybe even served as precursors to increase the probability of the catastrophe, but it's still not exactly the appropriate way to conceptualize it. And, because there's you inside you, and as a personality psychologist and as a clinical theorist, most of what I've talked to you guys about is your psyche and its structure as if it was like a soul that inhabited you. And there's some real utility in that. You're an individual demarcated from the community. You can be set up in a healthy manner or a non-healthy manner. The problem with that is that you're not just an individual. You're connected to all these external dynamic networks that are really, really important. And it isn't even easy to separate them from you. Like you might say, well, this is especially true once you become a parent, is your child more you than your arm? Well, you think it's pretty obvious that parts of you that are physically linked are more key to you as an entity, but it's by no means obvious. I think many people would much more happily sacrifice an arm than a child, and so your boundaries are not, where your boundaries are located are not precisely isomorphic with the outline of your body. It's not that simple at all, and so you're embedded in all sorts of networks that can pull you down rapidly or elevate you, because the other thing that happens is that, well, let's say I've never traded with anyone, and I go up to someone and I say, well, do you want to trade? And they say, well, why? How can I trust you? And the answer to that is, well, you have to take my word for it. Well, that's not a very good argument. You might say instead, well, here's what I have to offer, and you can evaluate it. But the person is likely to say, well, I don't know how to evaluate it, and so I'm still stuck with taking your word. So that's a bad problem. And you'll see that if you ever try to sell a product in the marketplace, is if the product is new and it's complex, then you're forcing the person that wants to buy it to evaluate it, and then you're forcing them to take the risk of being wrong as well as the time it would take to evaluate it, and they don't like that. What they want is what's often called social proof, which is, okay, well, you want to trade with me, who else have you traded with? And if the answer is 0, then they are going to say, well, you're an interesting person and all that, but I've got these other people over here who've already traded with a bunch of people, and therefore the risk is lower, in part because, let's say, I have a supervisor, and I'm going to make a decision. And my primary concern is that my supervisor will not hate me for making the decision. It's not that my primary concern is to make the best decision. It's not the same thing. It's that I want to make a decision that I'm not going to get in trouble for. Okay, so how do I do that? Because I need a post hoc justification. So I buy something from you and it turns out to be terrible. And I get called on the table for it. And what do I say? I say, well, that person was buying from it, and that person was buying from him, and that person was buying from him. Like, all these other people were doing the same thing, so it's not like the error is localized in me, and that's often a very credible story. But if the answer is, well, I evaluated it and decided to take a risk, it's like, well, out the door with you, Sonny, because, that's an indication that you're not capable of doing that sort of thing. So I think part of the reason that people spiral downhill into 0 is because positive feedback, like a positive feedback loop, is a loop that increases the probability that the loop will continue, right? A positive feedback loop is, you've experienced this when you hear microphone feedback in an amplified system. So, the microphone sends a message to the speakers, and then the speakers send out the message amplified, and then the microphone picks up the message and it gets amplified again, and you get this howling occur, which can be deafening, but can also destroy the system, because it'll keep amplifying upward until the speakers blow, for example. That's a positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop can spiral you upward, or it can spiral you downward. And so a virtuous circle, a virtuous positive feedback loop, is when, well, I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and now I can say to you, I've traded with these 3 people, and you go talk to them and they say good things, and so then you say, well, I'll trade with you, and then because of that, then you're even more likely to trade with me, and it's like the thing starts to spiral uphill, and it does that, I think, in a nonlinear form. And so, because one of the things you guys are going to be asking yourself as you mature, because what's happening is that income inequality is increasing, right? And you might ask, well, why is that? The first thing you need to know is that that's what income does. So it's not like you need an explanation for it. This is the explanation. It's like a natural rule. If you run a trading game to its logical conclusion, one person ends up with all the money and everyone else ends up with 0. There's a chapter in my book called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And I'm pretty happy about this chapter, although I suspect it'll be rather controversial. And, it's predicated first on the observation that many people hurt their children physically and psychologically. Because everyone gets sentimental about the relationship between parents and children, but that's especially in relationship to themselves, because they think, well, of course I'm going to be a good parent. It's like, it's not so bloody obvious that you're going to be a good parent, and then what I see happening with people who don't know how to discipline their children is that the children run roughshod over them in their, let's call them hierarchical disputes, because children push for position in hierarchy, and they do that behaviorally to sort of feel out the contours of the social structure. So, your kid will act perfectly fine at home, let's say, at the dinner table, but then you take them to a stranger's dinner table and all of a sudden they act out. And you think, what's up with you, you little monster? And what's up is that they're trying to figure out what the power structure is in the new... They don't know this, of course, but they're acting this out. They're trying to figure out if the same rules apply in this new situation as apply in the old situation. And they can't ask that, and they don't even know that they are rules exactly. They're regularities that they've learned. And so they'll test, and then you have to show them that, yeah, it's the same here. It's the same in this situation. But lots of parents are very uneasy with disciplining their children, partly because they believe that if you give a child infinite freedom, that's best for them, and that constraints are inappropriate, which is really just, well, I don't know what to say about that, except it's so untrue that it's very difficult to think of anything that's more untrue than that. But also the thing is if you let your children take advantage of you, if you have an ounce of spine and an ounce of aggression, which you do, especially if you don't admit it, then you will take revenge on your children. So if they have a temper tantrum in a grocery store and embarrass you, which a child who's canny can do quite effectively, because you wouldn't let them have that pack of crayons or a chocolate bar. And then, you tell yourself it's okay, and that you still, that really didn't make you that angry, and it's okay, but you're fuming inside. And then you go home, and half an hour later, maybe the child is doing some interesting little bit of work, maybe artwork or something, or does something good and comes up for a reward. It's like the probability that you're going to reward that child properly under those circumstances is zero. You're going to take the opportunity to take your revenge. And if you don't know that, then you're not much of a parent. And so part of the trick with kids is that if your child is doing something that makes you dislike them, that you have to figure out how to stop them from doing that and teach them how to do it properly. And you have to talk to your wife to make sure that you're not being too much of a monster, and the same with her. But that discipline is partly what enables you to continue to like your child while you love them. And even more than that, parents talk about fostering self-esteem and fostering creativity and all of that in their kids. And I think that's misbegotten. It's shallow for a variety of reasons. First, it's not that easy to foster creativity because it's rare, and self-esteem is a very badly defined concept, and mostly it's been used for harm, not good. What your job is as a parent is to help your child learn from between 2 years old and say 4 years old how to act in the world so that when people encounter them, people smile and are happy they're around. Because then, I've seen kids who behave badly, and everywhere they go, people wear false smiles, and everywhere they go, people are relieved when they leave. And that means you think about that world from the child's perspective. Everyone's lying, and everyone hates them. That's their world. And then if you have your child, capable of adhering to minimal social requirements, like maybe being able to sit at the table in a civilized manner for an hour and being grateful for being fed, let's say, and knowing how to share and knowing how to pay attention to adults and not having that, that kind of terrible cynicism and arrogance that can develop even in a 4-year-old child who's always had its way, then they'll interact with adults in a manner that bring out the best in the adults. And everywhere they go, everyone smiles at them and pats them on the head, maybe even tells them useful and interesting things. And so the whole world opens up for them. And that's all a consequence of you having enough courage to admit to yourself that your child can do things that you don't like and that you will take it out on them if you don't straighten it out. And people don't like that idea because they think, well, I'd never do anything. I love my child. I'd never do anything to hurt them. It's like, yeah, God, right. You're so asleep if you think that there's almost no hope for you. You have to think, I'm way bigger than this child, and I'm way meaner, and I'm way trickier, and I'm way more unpredictable. And so I better be very careful in my relationships with this child so that the worst of me doesn't come out. And then that gives you enough intelligence to make a disciplinary framework that's minimal and enforce it properly and carefully.